She wrapped her tiny child and closed her eyes to die in the cold, but woke as a man warmed them both. This incredible rescue story has become one of the most heartwarming stories ever documented, breaking every record for survival against impossible odds. But who was this mysterious stranger who appeared in the frozen wasteland when all hope was lost? On the abandoned terraforming planet, Alpha 16, where temperatures plummet to minus 40 degrees and corporate failures left thousands to die, a mother's final breath became the beginning of the most amazing survival story you'll ever hear. This real survival story didn't just save 2 lives, it sparked a movement proving that true stories of human compassion can still change the world, one heartwarming rescue at a time. Elena's bare feet sank into the snow with every sluggish step, her toes long since gone numb from the brutal cold that had become her constant companion on Alpha 16. The torn hem of her once ceremonial robe flapped weakly behind her, encrusted with frost, that told the story of 17 rejections. 17 doors slammed shut against a desperate mother and her dying child. Her purple skin, mottled by the relentless cold, looked nearly blue in the pale half-light that passed for day on this abandoned world. Strands of white hair clung to her cheeks, frozen in place by her own breath, each exhalation a visible reminder of how little life remained within her. In her arms, she held Kai, small and quiet, barely moving. His luminous freckles, those bioluminescent constellations scattered across his cheeks that had once made him the wonder of their community, were nearly dark now. A child's glow should never fade like this. Not like this. The 4.5-year-old had stopped asking when they would find warmth, stopped whimpering about the cold. That silence frightened Elena more than any scream ever could. When children stop complaining, when they retreat into that terrible quiet acceptance, it means they're preparing to let go. "Mama," he whispered, his voice no more than a vibration against her collarbone. Still cold. His hair, long and white like hers, fluttered against her skin as she pressed him tighter to her chest, shielding him from the wind with what little body heat she had left. But she could feel it ebbing away, that precious warmth that had sustained them both through this impossible journey across the frozen wasteland of Alpha 16. "Don't wake up," she murmured in their native tongue, her breath breaking into shudders that crystallized instantly in the bitter air. "It's better to dream warm." The words came from an old lullaby her own mother had sung back when the silver hearth cast had been her home, back when her hands had been kissed in gratitude by new parents, back when she had been someone who mattered. This was supposed to be one of the most heartwarming stories of rescue and redemption, but right now it felt like one of those cold-weather survival tales that ended in tragedy. Elena stumbled forward, knowing she wouldn't make it another hour. The terraforming project that had brought hope to Alpha 16 had collapsed a decade ago, leaving behind only the desperate and the dying. Horizon Axis Corporation had pulled out when their ambitious plans proved too costly, too dangerous, too impossible. The orbital heat arrays had failed, the subterranean reactors had malfunctioned, and the planned cities had become nothing more than rusted skeletons against the endless white. They had been turned away from every refuge across Alpha 16's skeletal remains. 17 shelters, 17 rejections, automated defense turrets and AI-operated trade stations that scanned her empty credit chip and closed their doors without a word. No community would take a starving alien woman and her child. Not without credit, not without power, not without a name that meant something in this harsh new world where survival stories were written in desperation and blood. Her name used to mean something. Once she had been Elena Aljavier, a midwife of the Silver Hearth caste revered for their sacred bond to life and warmth. She had held newborns wrapped in silk lighted sung over steaming pools of sleep blossoms, while new mothers recovered from their labor. Her hands had been kissed in gratitude, her blessing sought by families across 3 star systems. Those incredible rescue moments when a difficult birth became a celebration, when her skills had meant the difference between life and death. Those had been her true stories, her purpose, her identity. But then her mate had died in a sudden frost storm, leaving her alone with Kai. The commune elders had ruled her imbalanced unclean. A woman who could not support her child alone was believed to have a fractured spirit, they said. The old ways demanded balance, demanded completion, demanded perfection that she could no longer provide. She had stood before the temple door with Kai in her arms and whispered, "I can still care for him." The door had closed anyway. No farewell, no ritual, only exile. The memory stung even now, burning hotter than the cold ever could. It was the kind of mother and child rescue that should have come from within her own community, but instead had become the catalyst for their destruction. Her knees buckled beneath a rusted sky bridge, and she dropped into the snow with a cry she didn't have the strength to finish. The wind shrieked through broken cables overhead, a sound like all the heartwarming rescue stories that had never come true, all the amazing survival stories that had ended in loss instead of hope. She curled her arms tighter around Kai, trying to cover his back with her body. This wasn't how inspiring true stories were supposed to unfold. This wasn't the kind of real survival story that people shared to give each other hope. This was just ending quiet and cold and forgotten on a world that had been abandoned by everyone who mattered. "I'm here," she breathed, each word costing her precious warmth. "We're dreaming already, little one. Just keep dreaming." But even as she spoke, she knew she was lying. There would be no heartwarming stories emerging from this frozen wasteland, no incredible rescue waiting in the wings. Just a mother and child holding each other as the cold claimed them both. Kai whimpered softly, one tiny hand clutching her shredded braid. His eyes closed, and the last of his freckles dimmed to barely visible sparks. Elena felt her own strength leaving her, felt her grip on consciousness beginning to slip. The wind seemed to grow quieter, or perhaps her hearing was fading. Everything felt distant now, muffled as if she were sinking beneath still water. She had failed him. Failed to be the mother he deserved. Failed to find the safety he needed. Failed to write their story as one of those survival stories that ended in triumph rather than tragedy. The silver hearth cast had been right about her imbalance, her incompleteness. She wasn't strong enough to carry warmth alone. Her body slackened, surrendering to the stillness that had been calling to her for days. The cold no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like mercy, like an end to the constant struggle, like the peace that came after fighting too long and too hard against impossible odds. Her breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of her son's fading heartbeat against her chest. And then, far above, on the shattered lip of a nearby geothermal rig, something moved. A figure paused in its work, caught sight of a flicker in the blizzard below. The storm had been forcing him out again, sensor relay 4 had shorted out, and the geothermal lines were glitching, threatening to trigger an overload. Just another problem in a long line of failures on this dying world. But he hadn't expected to see movement this far out. Maybe wind-blown scrap, he thought at first. Then he saw the shape collapse, saw the smaller form clutched against it, and his gut turned to lead. Not again. Not another child. Not when he had the power to do something about it this time. Marcus ran. Snow whipped into his face plate, blinding and biting, but he didn't slow down. He stumbled over twisted struts and fallen piping boots, crunching over half-buried cables, driven by a desperate need to reach them before it was too late. This could be the beginning of one of those amazing survival stories, one of those true stories of human compassion that reminded people why hope mattered. He reached them within moments, but it already felt too late for any kind of incredible rescue. A woman with purple skin and white hair plastered to her face, clutching a child whose bioluminescent glow was dimming by the second. This was exactly the kind of scene that haunted his nightmares, the kind of moment that had driven him to this isolated existence 5 years ago. But this time, he had a second chance. 5 years earlier, Marcus Chen had been standing in a different kind of storm. Not snow, but ash and debris raining down as emergency sirens wailed across the mining colony of Kepler Station. He'd been the lead engineer on the evacuation protocols, the man responsible for getting 15,000 people off-world before the unstable reactor core went critical. His calculations had been perfect, his timing precise except for one fatal miscalculation. The delay he'd built into the system to double-check safety protocols had cost them exactly 47 minutes. 47 minutes that meant the difference between his 6-year-old niece Lily making it onto the last transport and her small body being found 3 days later in the ruins of the children's shelter. Not again, Marcus whispered now, dropping to his knees beside Elena and Kai in the snow. Not another child. His hands trembled as he pressed a pulse check pad to Kai's neck, searching for the faint flutter of life that would mean this incredible rescue story might still have a different ending than the nightmare that had driven him to Alpha 16. The child's skin was ice cold, his bioluminescent freckles barely visible sparks against purple-tinged flesh, but there, weak but steady, a heartbeat persisted. Marcus triggered 2 emergency heat packs from his thermal satchel, the kind designed for extreme cold-weather survival situations, and slid them carefully between Elena's body and her son's. She didn't react to his touch, her breathing so shallow he had to lean close to confirm she was still alive. Her purple skin had taken on that waxy quality that meant hypothermia was winning the battle against her alien physiology, but her grip on Kai remained fierce even in unconsciousness. "You're not dying like this," he growled, more to himself than to them. "Not tonight, not on my watch." He unzipped his heavy thermal coat and wrapped it around both of them, then lifted Elena with Kai still clutched against her chest. The weight startled him. They were too light, too fragile, as if the harsh realities of Alpha 16 had already begun consuming them from the inside out. For a breathless second, he was back in that medical transport 5 years ago, cradling Lily's fevered body while the bioclinic's automated systems denied them access due to insufficient credit authorization. This time, he had the power to change the outcome. This time, he wouldn't fail. Marcus had been living alone in the repurposed geothermal facility for 3 years now, long enough to transform the abandoned corporate infrastructure into something resembling a home. The original Horizon Axis engineers had built it to last with deep-core thermal taps that still provided reliable heat and power, even after the terraforming project's spectacular collapse. It wasn't beautiful utilitarian metal corridors, recycled air systems, and the constant hum of machinery, but it was warm, functional, and most importantly, it was off the grid. No corporate oversight, no bureaucratic protocols, no system that could delay a rescue while a child died waiting. He staggered back across the snow-choked landscape, fighting against wind that seemed determined to steal away this second chance at redemption. The facility's main hatch sealed behind him with a hiss of pressurized air, and immediately the warmth hit him like a physical embrace. It was one of those amazing survival stories where the difference between life and death came down to minutes, maybe seconds, and Marcus moved with the efficiency of someone who understood exactly how precious time could be. The child went into the medical cradle first, a jury-rigged combination of an old mining blanket and emergency heating elements that Marcus had designed after too many nights wondering what he would do if he ever faced this situation again. Kai's small body looked impossibly fragile against the improvised life support system, but Marcus had learned to trust his engineering instincts even when dealing with the delicate complexities of living beings instead of machines. Elena, he positioned near the main reactor duct where warm air pumped through repurposed ventilation pipes would gradually bring her body temperature back to sustainable levels. Then he settled in to wait, dropping bottle by careful bottle of warm electrolyte fluid between Kai's lips, monitoring vital signs with equipment salvaged from the old medical bay, and trying not to think about all the ways this heartwarming rescue attempt could still go wrong. The hours stretched like the long nights of Alpha 16's extended winter cycle. Marcus had grown accustomed to solitude over the past 5 years, but sitting vigil over two dying strangers brought back memories he'd spent those years trying to bury. The medical scanners beeped softly, a counterpoint to the deeper rhythm of the facility's life support systems, and every few minutes he would check Elena's pulse, adjust Kai's position, or simply stare at the child's slowly brightening freckles, and wonder if this was how redemption was supposed to feel, terrifying and precious and utterly beyond his control. Kai stirred first small fingers reaching toward Marcus's sleeve with the instinctive trust of a child who had never learned to fear strangers. His eyes opened slowly, those bioluminescent patterns across his cheeks glowing more brightly now that warmth was returning to his small body. He stared up at Marcus with the solemn curiosity of a 4-year-old trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly become very different. "You're not scary," Kai whispered, his voice rough and dreamy, but stronger than Marcus had dared hope. The simple statement hit Marcus harder than any complex analysis of his rescue techniques could have. Here was one of those inspiring true stories about second chances, about being present when it mattered most, about the difference between running away from failure and running toward the possibility of doing better. "I'm just tired like you, little guy," Marcus replied, offering the child another sip from the dropper bottle. The electrolyte solution was standard survival gear designed to restore balance to bodies pushed beyond their limits by extreme conditions, but watching Kai drink it felt like witnessing a minor miracle. "Tastes like sun," Kai murmured, and Marcus almost laughed despite the gravity of the situation. Close enough, he thought. Close enough to hope. The boy curled beside the heater and let his eyes drift closed again, but it was the sleep of recovery now, rather than the unconsciousness of impending death. Only then did Marcus allow himself to believe that this might actually become one of those real survival stories with a happy ending, one of those incredible rescue tales that reminded people why hope mattered even in the darkest circumstances. Elena moved long minutes later, and Marcus felt his breath catch as her eyes fluttered open. The first thing she did was search for Kai, panic flooding her features until she spotted him sleeping peacefully in the medical cradle. Only then did she take in her surroundings, the curved metal ceiling, the soft glow of the facility's lighting systems, the warmth that meant they were no longer dying of exposure on Alpha 16's frozen surface. "Where?" she began, her voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion, but Marcus raised a hand gently. "You're safe," he said simply. "Both of you. You collapsed near my facility. I brought you in." He didn't mention the 47 minutes that had haunted him for 5 years, didn't explain how finding them had felt like the universe offering him a chance to balance the scales. Those were his demons to carry, not hers. Elena's eyes moved carefully around the shelter, taking in the salvaged equipment, the improvised medical setup, the signs of long-term habitation. She was evaluating, he realized, determining whether this stranger represented salvation or a different kind of danger. After what she'd been through, after 17 rejections from communities that should have helped a mother and child in need, caution was more than warranted. "I'm not going to hurt you," Marcus added, recognizing the wariness in her expression. "I know what it's like to be alone, to be desperate. I know what it costs when people turn away instead of helping." He crouched slowly and placed a cup of warm broth on the floor between them, then stepped back to give her space. "You should drink. You were nearly frozen solid. I thought—" He didn't finish the sentence. Some fears were too heavy to voice, even after they'd been proven unfounded. Elena reached for the cup with hands that trembled only slightly, and Marcus saw it as a victory. This was what those heartwarming stories were really about. Not dramatic gestures or heroic declarations, but the simple act of accepting help when it was offered, of trusting a stranger's kindness when the world had given you every reason to expect cruelty instead. "How long?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "Half a day, maybe more," Marcus replied. "You were in bad shape, both of you. I wasn't sure." He trailed off, then added, "Your son is resilient, stronger than he looks." Elena's gaze moved to Kai again. and Marcus saw something in her expression that went beyond maternal love. A fierce protectiveness that had kept her fighting through impossible odds that had carried her and her child across the frozen wastelands of Alpha 16, when giving up would have been easier. This was the kind of mother and child rescue that mattered not because of the dramatic circumstances, but because of the quiet courage that had made survival possible in the first place. "He's all I have," she said simply, and Marcus understood. He'd lost his family in the Kepler station disaster, had spent 5 years believing he'd failed them irredeemably. But watching Elena with Kai, seeing the way she would have died rather than let go of her child, he began to understand that failure wasn't always about timing or protocols or perfect calculations. Sometimes it was about being there when it mattered most, about refusing to give up when everything seemed hopeless. "I'll give you space," Marcus said, moving toward the ladder that led to his private quarters. "I know how it feels waking up in a strange place. Call if you need anything." As he climbed toward his makeshift bedroom, Marcus allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in years. The possibility that this incredible rescue might be the beginning of something larger than survival. Something that might transform all three of them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Outside, Alpha 16's wind howled through the ruins of humanity's failed ambitions. But inside the geothermal facility, 2 strangers had found warmth, and Marcus had found something he'd thought lost forever, the chance to save a life when it mattered most. Elena woke to the sound of machinery humming beneath her, a steady rhythm that seemed to pulse through the metal floor and into her bones. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The warmth confused her, the absence of biting wind, the strange comfort of actually being able to feel her fingers and toes. Then memory crashed back the snow, the surrender, the moment she'd closed her eyes expecting never to open them again. Yet here she was, wrapped in thermal blankets that smelled of industrial recycling and human kindness, in what appeared to be some kind of survival shelter that looked nothing like the 17 places that had turned her away. The first thing she did was search for Kai. Panic flooded her system until she spotted him curled up in what looked like a makeshift medical cradle, just a few feet away, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of healthy sleep. His bioluminescent freckles glowed softly, in the dim lighting no longer the fading sparks of hypothermia, but the gentle constellation she remembered from happier times. The relief hit her so hard she almost cried out, but she caught herself. This was not her place, not her safety to assume. "He's stable," came a quiet voice from across the room. Elena turned to see the man who had rescued them, Marcus. He'd said his name, was sitting on what appeared to be a repurposed storage crate, holding a steaming mug in both hands. He looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from staying awake through worry rather than work. "Slept through the night. Good vital signs. His body temperature's been normal for hours now." Elena pushed herself upright slowly, her muscles protesting after their ordeal. The space around her was cramped but surprisingly well organized. Salvaged equipment lined the walls, everything from atmospheric processors to what looked like medical monitors. It was the kind of setup that spoke of long-term habitation, not temporary shelter. Someone had been living here for a while, making do with whatever the abandoned terraforming project had left behind. "Where exactly are we?" she asked, her voice still hoarse from the cold that had nearly claimed her voice permanently. Outside, she could hear the wind still howling, the storm that had driven her to collapse apparently far from over. "Geothermal Station 7, Marcus replied, gesturing vaguely toward the walls around them. One of the Horizon Axis facilities that actually worked. The thermal taps go deep enough to hit stable heat sources, so when the corporate evacuation happened, this place kept running. He took a careful sip from his mug. "I've been here about 4 years now. Retrofitted it for long-term habitation." Elena studied him more carefully now that she wasn't dying. He was perhaps in his late 30s, with the kind of weathered look that came from too much time in harsh environments and too little time around other people. His dark hair was longer than fashion would dictate, and his clothes were the practical layers of someone who understood that comfort came second to survival. But his eyes, there was something in them that spoke of loss of guilt carried too long. "Why?" she asked simply. It was one of those survival stories that didn't make sense on the surface, an engineer with obvious skills choosing to live alone on a planet that most people fled from. There had to be more to it. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into his mug, as if the answer might be written in the synthetic coffee substitute that was probably all Alpha 16 had to offer. "Sometimes running away is the only way forward," he said finally. "Sometimes staying where people know your mistakes means never being able to make different ones." Elena understood that feeling more than she cared to admit. The Silver Hearthcast elders had made it clear that her failure to maintain spiritual balance after her mate's death was not just a personal failing, but a contamination that could spread to others. Being declared unbalanced meant she was seen as spiritually contagious, a woman whose grief had made her unsuitable for the sacred work of midwifery. The exile had been presented as protection for the community, but Elena had always suspected it was really about the elders' discomfort with authentic emotion. "I know something about mistakes that follow you," she said carefully. "About being somewhere you're not wanted." Kai stirred in his makeshift bed, mumbling something in the mixture of standard and their native language that he often used when dreaming. Both adults turned toward him, and Elena saw Marcus's expression soften in a way that suggested he understood what it meant to care about a child's well-being. "He's been asking for you," Marcus said quietly, "when he was more awake earlier. Wanted to make sure you were dreaming warm. Seemed important to him." Elena felt her chest tighten. Those had been her words to him in what she'd thought were their final moments, a mother's attempt to make dying seem peaceful rather than terrifying. "It's something I used to tell him when times were difficult before we came here. Alpha 16 doesn't exactly seem like a first choice for relocation," Marcus observed, and there was no judgment in his voice, just curiosity. "Most people who end up here are running from something or towards something desperate." This was the conversation Elena had been dreading, the explanation of how a former midwife of one of the galaxy's most respected spiritual communities had ended up dying in the snow with her 4-year-old son. It wasn't one of those heartwarming rescue stories that ended with everyone understanding each other perfectly. It was messier than that, more complicated, full of the kind of cultural details that didn't translate well across species lines. "I was exiled," she said simply, "from my people. After my mate died, the elders decided I was unfit for my duties, spiritually compromised. They said my grief made me dangerous to the community." Marcus's expression darkened slightly. They exiled me for grieving incorrectly," Elena corrected. "The Silver Hearth caste believes in balance and maintaining spiritual equilibrium even in the face of loss. When my mate died in a storm accident, I was expected to channel my sorrow into ritual blessing to transform personal pain into communal healing. Instead, I broke down, wailed, showed what they considered unseemly emotion." She could see Marcus processing this information, probably trying to understand how any community could punish someone for responding naturally to loss. It was one of those cultural gaps that made real survival stories more complex than simple good versus evil narratives. "That's unconscionable," he said finally. "Punishing someone for being human, not human," Elena reminded him gently, "and not according to their understanding of spiritual health. In their view, my inability to maintain balance proved I was no longer capable of the sacred work. A midwife who cannot control her own emotional state cannot be trusted with the spiritual welfare of newborns and new mothers." Kai chose that moment to wake up properly, his eyes opening slowly as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings. But when he saw Elena sitting up and talking, his face broke into a smile that could have powered the facility's lighting systems. "Mama," he said, reaching for her with the automatic trust of a child who had never doubted that his mother would find a way to keep them both alive. "You're awake. Are we dreaming warm now?" Elena moved carefully to his side, gathering him into her arms with the relief of someone who had thought she might never hold her child again. "We're dreaming, very warm little flame. This kind man saved us from the cold." Kai turned his attention to Marcus with the frank curiosity of a 4-year-old meeting someone new. "Are you the one who makes the warm?" he asked. Marcus almost smiled. "I guess I am. My name is Marcus. What's yours?" "Kai," the boy replied solemnly. "I'm 4.5. My freckles glow when I'm happy." As if to demonstrate the bioluminescent patterns across his cheeks brightened noticeably. "I noticed that," Marcus said. "It's remarkable. I've never seen anything like it. Mama says they're like stars." Kai continued warming to the subject. "She says every person has stars inside them, but most people's stars are too small to see. Mine just happen to be bigger." Elena felt her throat tighten at the memory of explaining Kai's unusual genetics to him in terms that would make him feel special rather than different. The silver hearth caste had viewed his bioluminescence as another sign of her spiritual imbalance. Children of truly balanced parents, they claimed, did not manifest such unusual traits. "Your mama is wise," Marcus said, and Elena caught something in his voice that suggested he meant it. "Would you like something to eat? I've got some protein paste that doesn't taste completely terrible." As Marcus moved to prepare what passed for breakfast in this improvised household, Elena found herself observing the dynamics carefully. This was not the kind of incredible rescue where the heroic stranger immediately became part of the family. Instead, it was the more realistic version where 3 people who didn't know each other had to figure out how to coexist in a space designed for one. The food, when it came, was indeed not completely terrible, though it wouldn't win any culinary awards. Kai ate with the enthusiasm of a child who had been genuinely hungry, while Elena forced herself to consume enough to rebuild her strength. Marcus ate mechanically as if nutrition was just another engineering problem to be solved efficiently. "How long can we stay?" Elena asked, finally voicing the question that had been haunting her since she'd awakened. "I mean, we're grateful for the rescue, but I understand this is your home. We don't want to impose longer than necessary." Marcus looked up from his meal, and Elena saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or something more complex. "Where would you go?" he asked reasonably. "The storm's not letting up anytime soon, and even when it does, you said yourself that 17 communities already turned you away." It was the practical question Elena had been avoiding thinking about. Alpastine offered few options for refugees, especially refugees with a child in tow and no resources to trade for shelter. Most of the remaining settlements were barely surviving themselves with no capacity for charity, even if they'd been inclined toward kindness. "I don't know," she admitted. "I was hoping something would present itself." "Something like freezing to death in a snowbank?" Marcus asked, and there was an edge to his voice that suggested this conversation was touching on his own fears and guilt. "That wasn't the plan," Elena said defensively. "I was trying to reach the mining settlement in Sector 12. Someone told me they might take workers even if those workers had children." "Sector 12 was abandoned 6 months ago," Marcus informed her quietly. "The mine played out, and the corporation pulled everyone off-world. There's nothing there now but empty buildings and broken equipment." The silence that followed this revelation was heavy with implications. Elena had been carrying Kai toward a destination that no longer existed, following information that was fatally outdated. If Marcus hadn't found them, they would have died for nothing, not even the dignity of dying while pursuing a real hope. "I see," Elena said finally. "Then I suppose we're in a more difficult situation than I realized." Kai, who had been following the adult conversation with the partial understanding of a young child, looked between them with growing concern. "Are we still dreaming warm?" he asked quietly. Elena reached over to stroke his hair, the automatic gesture of a mother reassuring her child even when she had no real comfort to offer. Yes, little flame, we're still warm. Marcus stood abruptly, moving to stare out one of the small windows that showed nothing but swirling snow and failing light. The storm's going to last at least another 3 days, he said without turning around. Maybe longer, even after it passes traveling with a child in winter conditions. He trailed off, leaving the obvious conclusion unspoken. You're saying we're stuck here, Elena said. I'm saying you're welcome here, Marcus corrected, turning back to face them. For as long as you need. This place is designed for long-term habitation. There's room for 3 people barely, and enough resources to keep everyone fed and warm through the worst of Alpha 16's winter. Elena studied his face, looking for the catch, the price, the conditions that would make this incredible rescue into something more complicated. In her experience, kindness from strangers usually came with expectations that weren't immediately obvious. What do you get out of it? She asked bluntly. Marcus was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. The chance to save someone when it matters, he said simply. The chance to not fail when failure means a child dies. It wasn't the complete answer Elena knew, but it felt like an honest one. And in the warmth of the geothermal facility, with Kai's freckles glowing contentedly and the sound of life-sustaining machinery humming around them, she found herself thinking that maybe some heartwarming stories began not with perfect understanding, but with the simple decision to trust a stranger's kindness when the alternative was dying alone in the cold. 3 days into what was becoming an extended cohabitation, Elena discovered the story chips while helping Marcus organize supplies in the lower storage compartment. They were tucked away in a sealed container labeled Personal Archives, dozens of data crystals that caught the light with the familiar prismatic gleam of silver hearth-cast recording technology. Her breath caught as she lifted one from the collection, recognizing the distinctive spiral etchings that marked stories from her homeworld. "Where did you get these?" she asked, holding up a chip that pulsed with the soft inner light of preserved memories. Marcus looked up from the atmospheric recycling unit he'd been cleaning and saw what she'd found. Something complicated crossed his face, embarrassment perhaps, or the look of someone caught keeping secrets that weren't quite shameful but weren't easy to explain either. "Salvage operations," he said after a moment. "When I first came to Alpha 16, I spent a lot of time going through what the evacuation left behind. Corporate personnel abandoned a lot of personal items when the terraforming project collapsed. I kept the ones that seemed important." Elena turned the chip over in her hands, feeling the familiar weight of stories preserved in crystal matrix technology. "This one contains The Wanderer's Return," she said, softly reading the inscription with eyes that had grown accustomed to finding her people's writing in unexpected places. "It's one of our most beloved tales. Children usually hear it for the first time during their naming ceremonies." Kai, who had been quietly arranging his collection of interesting rocks in the corner, looked up with sudden interest. "Like the stories Papa used to tell?" he asked, his bioluminescent freckles brightening with curiosity. Elena felt her throat tighten at the mention of her late mate, but nodded. "Very much like those stories, little flame. Would you like to hear one?" What followed was one of those small moments that transforms survival stories into something deeper than mere endurance. Marcus rigged a simple projection system using salvaged equipment, and the 3 of them sat in the facility's main living area while Elena's voice brought ancient tales to life in the warm glow of recycled air and geothermal heating. It was Elena realized the first time since their exile that she had been able to share her culture with someone who listened without judgment, who appreciated the stories for their beauty, rather than analyzing them for signs of spiritual corruption. "Your people have a gift for narrative," Marcus said quietly, after Elena finished the tale of 2 star-crossed lovers, whose sacrifice had created the constellation patterns that guided space travelers home. There's something in the way these stories are structured. They're teaching tools as much as entertainment. That's exactly what they are, Elena confirmed, pleased that he understood. The Silver Hearth caste believes that wisdom cannot be simply transferred from one person to another. It must be discovered through experience and reflection. Stories provide the experience. The listener provides the reflection. Kai had fallen asleep curled against Elena's side, his small body radiating the contentment of a child who had gone from near death to safety in the span of a few days. But it was Marcus's continued attention that surprised Elena. Most outsiders lost interest in Silver Hearth caste culture once they realized it required active participation rather than passive consumption. "I used to tell stories to my niece," Marcus said, eventually his voice carrying the careful weight of someone sharing painful memories. "Nothing as sophisticated as these just bedtime stories, fairy tales I half remembered from my own childhood. She always wanted to know what happened after the ending, how the characters lived their lives once the dramatic events were over." Elena studied his face in the soft light of the facility's evening illumination. "Children often ask the most important questions," she said. "The ones adults stop thinking to ask." "She wanted to be an engineer like me when she grew up," Marcus continued. "Said she was going to build cities in space that would never fall down, never need to be evacuated. She was 6 years old and already planning to solve problems that had stumped entire corporations." The pain in his voice was fresh despite the years that had passed, and Elena recognized it as the grief of someone who had never been allowed to properly mourn. "What was her name?" she asked gently. "Lily," Marcus said. "Lily Chen. She would have been 11 now, probably already building impossible things out of scrap metal and determination." Elena shifted carefully to avoid waking Kai, but reached out to touch Marcus's hand briefly. "She sounds like she was remarkable, like someone who would have grown up to create amazing things." "She was," Marcus agreed. "She was everything bright and curious and hopeful about humanity, and I failed her when she needed me most." This was the heart of one of those real survival stories that went deeper than cold weather survival or incredible rescue scenarios. The story of people carrying guilt that was slowly destroying them from the inside. Elena understood that burden intimately. The Silver Hearth caste elders had made it clear that her inability to maintain spiritual balance after her mate's death had been a failure of character, a weakness that endangered the entire community. She had been carrying that judgment for months now, letting it shape her understanding of her own worth. "Guilt is a poison," she said quietly. "I know, because I've been drinking it for months now, believing that my grief over my mate's death made me spiritually contaminated, unfit for the sacred work of midwifery. But sitting here watching you care for my son with such gentle attention, I'm beginning to think that maybe the elders were wrong. Maybe grief isn't a sign of spiritual weakness. Maybe it's a sign of having loved something worth mourning." Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring at the story chip Elena still held. "I keep thinking about what Lily would say if she could see me now," he said, finally. "She always had opinions about everything, especially about whether adults were being logical or just being scared. I think she'd tell me that hiding on Alpha 16 for 5 years wasn't actually solving the problem that got her killed." "What would solving it look like?" Elena asked. "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "For the longest time, I thought it meant making sure I never had to make life or death decisions for anyone else ever again. But then I found you and Kai in the snow, and suddenly I was back to calculating timing and resources and acceptable risk levels. And this time it worked out. This time I saved the people who needed saving." Elena looked down at her sleeping son, his freckles providing a gentle constellation of light in the facility's dimmed evening mode. "Maybe that's what solving it looks like," she suggested. "Not avoiding the responsibility, but accepting it and doing better." The conversation was interrupted by an alarm from Marcus's monitoring system, a soft but insistent chime That meant something, and the facility's complex network of sensors and automated systems required attention. Marcus rose immediately, his engineer's instincts taking over as he moved to the main control panel. "What is it?" Elena asked, carefully settling Kai more comfortably on the improvised couch before joining Marcus at the controls. "Temperature fluctuation in the greenhouse module." Marcus replied, his fingers dancing over the interface as he pulled up diagnostic displays. "The heating system's been struggling since the last storm. I've been meaning to do a full maintenance cycle, but..." He trailed off, and Elena could fill in the rest. But he'd been busy keeping 2 rescued strangers alive, managing resources stretched to accommodate 3 people instead of 1, adapting systems designed for a solitary operation to support a makeshift family. The greenhouse had been a project for better times, not a priority when survival was still uncertain. "Show me," Elena said simply. Marcus looked at her in surprise. "It's pretty technical. The environmental controls are integrated with the atmospheric processing system, and the nutrient delivery mechanisms are jury-rigged from mining equipment. It's not the kind of problem that someone without engineering training could help with." Elena finished. "You're right, I don't understand the technical aspects, but I do understand growing things. I spent years helping families nurture new life under difficult conditions. If you can keep the systems running, I can help you figure out what the plants actually need." It was a small moment of partnership, but it felt significant in the context of their developing relationship. These were the kinds of inspiring true stories that mattered, not dramatic rescues or heroic gestures, but the quiet decision to work together on something that required both technical knowledge and intuitive understanding. The greenhouse itself was a marvel of improvised engineering, a sealed dome attached to the facility's main structure where Marcus had been attempting to grow food in Alpha 16's hostile environment. The space was warm and humid, filled with the earthy smell of growing things and the soft hum of environmental controls working overtime to maintain life-supporting conditions. Most of the growing beds were still empty, but Elena could see where Marcus had been experimenting with different crops, trying to find something that would thrive in the artificial ecosystem he'd created. "The heating elements keep cycling irregularly," Marcus explained, showing Elena the control panels that monitored temperature, humidity, and atmospheric composition throughout the dome. "I can maintain basic environmental parameters, but the fine-tuning needed for optimal plant growth is beyond what I can manage with current resources." Elena moved slowly through the greenhouse, touching soil, examining the few plants that were struggling to establish themselves, reading the space with senses trained by years of coaxing life into difficult circumstances. "The problem isn't just temperature," she said after a few minutes. "The soil composition is wrong for most of the species you're trying to grow. These plants evolved in specific ecosystems with particular combinations of minerals and microorganisms that support their development. You're providing them with technically adequate nutrition, but not the complex biological environment they need to thrive. I don't have access to native soil samples from their homeworlds," Marcus pointed out reasonably. "Everything has to be synthesized from available materials." "I know," Elena said, kneeling beside one of the struggling plants and examining its root development. "But there might be another way. The silver hearth cast techniques for cultivation don't rely on replicating original ecosystems exactly. Instead, we focus on creating new equilibrium states that support life in different ways. It's about partnership rather than domination, working with the plants to find conditions that serve everyone's needs." What followed was several hours of the kind of work that transforms heartwarming rescue stories into something more complex and lasting. Elena couldn't fix Marcus's heating system, but she could teach him to read the subtle signs that indicated when plants were thriving versus merely surviving. Marcus couldn't replicate the spiritual practices that had made Elena such an effective midwife, but he could adapt his engineering systems to respond more sensitively to the biological rhythms Elena could recognize. By the time Kai woke up from his nap, they had successfully stabilized the greenhouse environment and planted seeds that Elena believed had a real chance of flourishing. It was a small victory, but it felt like the beginning of something larger, the possibility that their temporary cohabitation might become something more intentional and permanent. "Look, little flame," Elena said, lifting Kai up so he could see the newly planted growing beds. "We're going to try to make things grow here. Would you like to help take care of them?" Kai's freckles brightened with excitement as he surveyed the greenhouse with the enthusiasm of a child discovering a new adventure. "Can we grow the singing flowers?" he asked. "The ones from Papa's stories that change colors when they're happy." Elena and Marcus exchanged a look over Kai's head, the kind of glance that passes between adults who are beginning to understand that they might be creating something together, something that could become home for all of them. "We can try," Elena said. "We can definitely try." The emergency beacon activated at 0347 hours, 17 days after Elena and Kai had first opened their eyes in Marcus's geothermal facility. The piercing electronic shriek cut through the comfortable darkness of what had become their shared sleeping space, jolting all three of them from dreams of warmth and safety into the harsh reality of survival on Alpha 16. Marcus was on his feet before Elena had fully processed what was happening, his engineer's instincts taking over as he raced toward the facility's main control center. "What is it?" Elena called after him, gathering Kai into her arms as the boy whimpered in confusion. The alarm was unlike anything they'd heard during their weeks together, not the familiar chimes of routine system maintenance or the gentle alerts that meant minor adjustments were needed. This was the sound of catastrophic failure of systems designed to prevent disaster, screaming warnings into the frozen night. "Emergency distress beacon," Marcus replied tersely, his fingers flying over the control interface as he tried to isolate the source of the signal. Something triggered the automated SOS system. "It's broadcasting our location on multiple frequencies, including the old corporate emergency channels." Elena felt her blood turn to ice water. During their 17 days together, she had allowed herself to believe that their little family was invisible, hidden away in Marcus's carefully maintained refuge where the outside world couldn't find them. The beacon changed everything. Now they were a bright signal in the darkness, calling out to anyone with the equipment to receive distress calls on Alpha 16. "Can you shut it off?" she asked, moving closer to the control panels while keeping Kai pressed against her chest. The boy's bioluminescent freckles were pulsing rapidly with anxiety, responding to the tension radiating from both adults. "I'm trying," Marcus said, but Elena could hear the frustration in his voice. "The system's locked into emergency mode. It's designed to prevent accidental shutdown during actual crisis situations. I can't override it without—" He trailed off, staring at the diagnostic readouts with growing alarm. "Without what?" Elena pressed. "Without physically accessing the transmitter array," Marcus finished grimly, "which is located on the facility's outer hull exposed to the current weather conditions. And according to the meteorological sensors, we're looking at wind speeds of 60 kilometers per hour and a temperature of minus 43 degrees Celsius. Elena looked toward the facility's small windows, where she could see snow whipping past in horizontal sheets. Even inside their shelter, she could hear the storm raging with the kind of fury that turned Alpha 16's winter into a death sentence for anyone caught outside without proper protection. The idea of Marcus attempting to repair equipment in those conditions while she and Kai waited helplessly inside felt like a nightmare scenario. "How long will the beacon broadcast?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Indefinitely," Marcus confirmed. "It's powered by the facility's main reactor, and it's designed to continue signaling until someone responds to the distress call or the power supply fails completely." The implications hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Alpha 16 attracted few visitors, but the ones who did come were rarely the kind of people who responded to emergency signals out of altruistic concern for stranded survivors. Scavengers, raiders, corporate security teams looking for escaped workers. Anyone who received their distress call would be more likely to see them as resources to be exploited rather than fellow humans in need of rescue. "We have to leave," Elena said quietly, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "Pack what we can carry and find somewhere else to shelter until the storm passes." Marcus turned from the control panel to stare at her. "Elena, look outside. We wouldn't survive an hour in those conditions, let alone long enough to reach another shelter. And even if we could, where would we go? You said yourself that 17 communities already turned you away. Now you'd be traveling with a man who's been living off the grid for 4 years. We'd be 3 refugees with no resources, no connections, and a small child to protect." Elena knew he was right, but the alternative seemed equally impossible. "Then what do you suggest we wait here for whoever responds to that signal to arrive and hope they're more interested in heartwarming rescue stories than in whatever they might be able to extract from us?" "I suggest we disable the beacon," Marcus said firmly. "It's dangerous, but it's not impossible. The transmitter array is accessible through the external maintenance hatch. I've done repairs out there before, though never in weather this severe. You could die out there," Elena pointed out bluntly. "Hypothermia equipment failure, a simple slip that sends you falling into the storm. We'd lose you and Kai, and I would be right back where we started, except this time we'd be trapped in a facility we don't know how to operate properly." Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying the beacon's status displays with the calculating expression Elena had learned to recognize as his engineering mind working through complex problems. "There's another option," he said slowly. "You could come with me." Elena blinked in surprise. "What?" "2 people working together could disable the beacon faster than 1 person working alone," Marcus explained. "The repair requires someone to maintain power to the access systems while someone else physically disconnects the transmitter components. It's usually a 2-person job anyway. I've just been making do with automated assistance systems." "I don't know anything about transmitter repair," Elena protested. "You don't need to," Marcus replied. "You need to know how to follow instructions and work as part of a team under pressure, both of which you've already demonstrated you can do." He gestured toward the greenhouse where their collaborative efforts had resulted in the first successful food production the facility had seen in years. Elena looked down at Kai, who was listening to their conversation with the wide-eyed attention of a child, trying to understand adult problems that were beyond his comprehension. The thought of leaving him alone in the facility while she and Marcus risked their lives outside made her stomach clench with protective fury. But the thought of waiting passively for unknown threats to arrive felt even worse. "What about Kai?" she asked. "He stays here in the secure inner compartment," Marcus said. "It's the warmest, safest part of the facility. The heating system can run on automated backup power for hours if needed. We lock the blast doors and give him the emergency communicator so he can call for us if something goes wrong." It was, Elena realized, the kind of impossible choice that survival stories were built around. Risk everything to protect what mattered most, or lose everything by trying to play it safe. The beacon continued its electronic shrieking, each pulse a reminder that time was running out, and that every moment they spent debating brought potential threats closer to their location. "How long would the repair take?" she asked finally. 20 minutes, if everything goes perfectly," Marcus replied honestly. "Up to an hour if we run into complications. The storm makes everything more difficult, but the work itself isn't technically complex." Elena closed her eyes and tried to imagine explaining to Kai why she and Marcus were leaving him alone in the facility. He had already lost his father and experienced exile from everything familiar. The idea of adding abandonment to his list of childhood traumas felt unbearable. But the alternative, waiting for hostile strangers to respond to their distress call, felt equally impossible. "Kai," she said gently, crouching down so she was at eye level with her son. "Marcus and I need to go outside for a little while to fix something that's broken. You would stay here where it's warm and safe." Do you think you could be very brave for us? Kai's freckles pulsed thoughtfully as he considered her words. Like in the stories, he asked. When the heroes have to do scary things to protect their families. Elena felt her throat tighten. Yes, little flame, exactly like in the stories. Will you come back? Kai asked, with the devastating directness of a 4-year-old who had already learned that adults sometimes left and never returned. We will come back, Elena promised, hoping desperately that it was a promise she would be able to keep. Marcus knows how to fix the broken thing, and I'm going to help him. We'll be very careful and we'll be back before you know it. What followed was 30 minutes of frantic preparation that felt like one of those amazing survival stories where every detail mattered, and every decision could mean the difference between life and death. Marcus assembled 2 sets of extreme weather gear layering thermal suits with additional insulation and emergency heating elements. Elena helped Kai set up a comfortable nest in the facility's most secure compartment, complete with food, water, entertainment, and the emergency communicator that would let him contact them if anything went wrong. Remember, Marcus told Kai as they prepared to seal the blast doors, if anyone tries to contact the facility while we're outside, you don't respond. You stay quiet and hidden until we come back. Can you do that? Kai nodded solemnly, his small face serious with the weight of responsibility. I'll be brave, like Mama, he said. I'll take care of our home. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Our home. When had this place stopped being Marcus's refuge and become their shared sanctuary? When had the 3 of them stopped being strangers thrown together by circumstance and become a family worth fighting for? The journey to the external maintenance hatch was a nightmare of howling wind and driving snow that turned the familiar corridors of the facility into an alien landscape. Even with extreme weather protection, Elena could feel the cold seeping through her layers, reminding her of those terrible hours when she had carried Kai through the storm believing they were both going to die. The difference now was that she wasn't fleeing toward an uncertain destination. She was fighting to protect something precious, something worth the risk. The transmitter array was located on the facility's upper hull, accessible through a maintenance shaft that felt like climbing into the mouth of a screaming monster. The wind was a living thing that grabbed at their equipment and tried to tear them away from their safety lines. Elena's hands were numb despite her insulated gloves, and she had to fight to keep her grip on the tools Marcus handed her. Can you see the primary coupling assembly? Marcus shouted over the storm, his voice barely audible even through their communication headsets. Elena squinted through the driving snow at the complex arrangement of cables and junction boxes that made up the beacon's transmission system. Everything was covered in ice, and the wind made it impossible to work with any precision. I think so, she called back. The red housing unit. That's it. I need you to maintain power to the coupling while I disconnect the signal amplifiers. When I give you the signal cut power for exactly 10 seconds, then restore it. What followed was 10 minutes of the most terrifying technical work Elena had ever attempted. Every movement was a battle against the storm, every tool transfer a potential disaster if either of them lost their grip. Her world narrowed to the immediate task: hold this cable steady, count the seconds precisely. Don't let the wind tear the equipment from Marcus's hands. When the beacon finally went silent, the sudden absence of its electronic shrieking felt like a physical relief. But they still had to get back inside the facility, still had to return to Kai, and hope that their absence hadn't been long enough for hostile forces to track the signal to its source. Elena had never appreciated the simple miracle of warmth until she and Marcus stumbled back through the facility's inner doors, their emergency suits crackling with ice and their faces numb from cold exposure. Kai's freckles blazed with joy as he threw himself into Elena's arms, and she realized that this was what incredible rescue stories were really about. Not just saving lives, but protecting the connections that made those lives worth living. Did you fix it? Kai asked, looking between Elena and Marcus with the trust of a child who believed the adults in his life could solve any problem. "We fixed it," Marcus confirmed, pulling off his thermal helmet and running a hand through his ice-crusted hair. "The beacon is silent. We're invisible again." But even as he spoke the words, Elena could see the tension that remained in his shoulders, the wariness in his eyes as he checked the facility's external sensors. They had bought themselves time, but they hadn't eliminated the underlying threat. Alpha 16 remained a harsh world where survival stories were written in blood and desperation, where three people trying to build a life together were still vulnerable to forces beyond their control. For now, though they were safe, they were together. And in the warm glow of the facility's heating systems, with Kai's laughter echoing off the metal walls, and Marcus's quiet competence keeping their systems running smoothly, Elena allowed herself to believe that sometimes survival stories had happy endings after all. The evening settled over their makeshift family with the kind of peace that Elena had forgotten was possible. Kai had fallen asleep hours ago, curled up in his favorite spot near the main heating vent with a collection of story chips scattered around him like glowing breadcrumbs. The facility hummed with its familiar rhythm of life support systems and geothermal processing sounds that had become as comforting as a lullaby over the past 3 weeks. Elena found herself moving quietly through their shared space, straightening already tidy surfaces and checking systems that didn't need checking simply because the domesticity of it felt precious. Marcus sat at the small table they'd improvised from salvaged equipment, working on what appeared to be technical schematics, but was actually something far more personal. Elena had noticed him drawing during quiet moments, detailed sketches of the greenhouse expansion they'd been planning, architectural diagrams for additional living space, even careful renderings of the story chip display case he wanted to build for Kai's growing collection of cultural artifacts. "Planning our future?" Elena asked softly, settling into the chair across from him. The question came out more loaded than she'd intended, carrying weight that surprised them both. Marcus looked up from his drawings, and Elena saw something vulnerable in his expression that made her breath catch. Over the weeks since their dangerous mission to disable the emergency beacon, their relationship had deepened in ways that neither of them had expected. What had begun as practical cooperation had evolved into something more complex, a partnership that felt both inevitable and impossibly fragile. "I keep thinking about what happens next," Marcus admitted, setting down his stylus and leaning back in his chair. "The beacon crisis made me realize how temporary all of this could be, how quickly we could lose what we've built here." Elena understood the fear beneath his words. They had created something remarkable in the isolation of Alpha 16, a family forged from necessity that had become genuine love, a home carved out of hostile environment that had become a sanctuary. But it existed in a precarious balance dependent on systems that could fail, threatened by external forces they couldn't control, vulnerable to the simple reality that none of them had chosen this life originally. "Do you want it to be permanent?" Elena asked the question, hanging in the air between them like a held breath. "This arrangement, this family we've accidentally created, do you want it to be real?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving toward the sleeping area where Kai's soft breathing provided a gentle counterpoint to the facility's mechanical sounds. "I never thought I'd want to be responsible for anyone else's life again," he said finally. "After what happened with Lily, I convinced myself that caring about people just meant having more ways to fail them." Elena reached across the table and touched his hand gently. "But you haven't failed us. You saved us. Multiple times." "I got lucky," Marcus corrected, but there was less self-recrimination in his voice than there had been weeks ago. "The timing worked out, the equipment functioned properly, the storm didn't kill us during the beacon repair. But luck isn't sustainable, Elena. Eventually, something will go wrong that I can't fix, and then we face it together," Elena finished firmly. "The way we faced the beacon crisis, The way we've faced everything since you found us in the snow. You're not carrying the responsibility alone anymore, Marcus. That's what family means. Shared burdens, shared risks, shared commitment to keeping each other safe. The word family seemed to settle between them with surprising weight. They had been using it casually for weeks now, mostly in reference to Kai's perspective on their arrangement. But saying it explicitly acknowledging what they had become, rather than what they had started as, felt like crossing a threshold neither of them could uncross. "I need to tell you something," Elena said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "About why I was really exiled from the Silver Hearth caste. About what happened after my mate died." Marcus's attention sharpened, and Elena could see him preparing to listen with the same careful focus he brought to technical problems. But this wasn't a mechanical issue that could be solved with the right tools and sufficient expertise. This was the kind of heartwarming story that came with shadows, the kind of real survival story that required acknowledging painful truths. "I told you that the elders declared me spiritually unbalanced after my mate's death." Elena began, her hands twisting in her lap as she spoke. "That they exiled me for grieving incorrectly, for showing emotion that they considered unseemly for someone of my position." "I remember," Marcus said quietly. "What I didn't tell you is that I agreed with them." Elena continued, the words coming out in a rush, now that she'd started. "Not about the exile that was cruel and unnecessary, but about my spiritual balance. I did break down completely after the accident. I couldn't perform my duties, couldn't guide new mothers through their birthing ceremonies, couldn't even maintain the sacred fires that were central to our religious practices." Marcus waited, sensing that there was more to the story than professional inability. The breaking point came during a particularly difficult birth. Elena said, her voice growing steadier as she settled into the painful memory. A first-time mother complications that required all of my skill and experience to resolve safely. But in the middle of the ceremony, she looked at me and said something that reminded me of my mate, just a casual phrase, something he used to say when he was encouraging me through difficult situations. Elena paused, closing her eyes as she relived the moment that had changed everything. "I collapsed," she said simply. "Right there in the birthing chamber with a woman in active labor depending on me for guidance and support. I couldn't stop crying, couldn't function, couldn't be the spiritual anchor she needed. Other midwives had to take over, and the birth was successful, but the damage was done. Everyone saw that I was too broken to fulfill my sacred responsibilities." Marcus's hand tightened around hers, offering silent support as she worked through the memory. "The elders were right about one thing," Elena continued. "I wasn't fit to be a midwife anymore. Not because my grief was spiritually contaminating, but because I hadn't processed it properly. I had been trying to compartmentalize the loss to continue functioning as if nothing had changed, instead of allowing myself to heal authentically." "And now?" Marcus asked gently. Elena looked around their improvised home, taking in the evidence of the life they'd built together. Kai's artwork stuck to the walls with improvised adhesive, the greenhouse visible through the connecting corridor where their joint efforts had produced actual food, the comfortable familiarity of shared space that had evolved organically over weeks of cooperation. "Now I think the elders were wrong about what healing looks like," she said. "They believed that spiritual balance meant maintaining emotional equilibrium under all circumstances, never showing weakness or vulnerability. But living here with you and Kai has taught me that real healing comes from connection, from allowing yourself to be cared for when you're broken, from building something new, rather than trying to restore something that was destroyed." Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing her words. "Do you miss it?" he asked finally. "The work you used to do, the community you used to be part of?" "I miss the sense of purpose," Elena admitted. "The feeling that my skills and knowledge were making a meaningful difference in people's lives. But I don't miss the isolation of that kind of responsibility, the pressure to be perfect all the time. The loneliness of carrying everyone else's spiritual welfare without having anyone to carry mine. She gestured toward Kai's sleeping form, then back to Marcus. This feels more sustainable. This feels like a life I could actually live long-term, rather than a role I was trying to perform. The conversation was interrupted by a soft sound from Kai's sleeping area. Not distress, just the gentle murmur of a child shifting position in his sleep. Both adults turned toward him automatically, their parental instincts activated by the mere possibility that he might need something. "He's been having good dreams lately," Elena observed. "His freckles glow differently when he's genuinely content versus when he's just comfortable. These past few weeks, the glow has been brighter, more consistent." "He feels safe," Marcus said, and there was wonder in his voice as if the idea of providing safety for a child still surprised him. "When I first found you both in the snow, I was terrified that I would fail him the way I failed Lily. But watching him thrive here, seeing how he's grown and learned and adapted, it's like getting a second chance at something I thought I'd lost forever." Elena stood and moved to Marcus's side of the table, drawn by the vulnerability in his voice and the need to offer comfort in return for all the comfort he'd provided. When she placed her hand on his shoulder, he looked up at her with an expression that made her heart race. "We're not the same people who ended up on Alpha 16 by accident," she said softly. "You're not the guilt-ridden engineer hiding from his failures, and I'm not the broken midwife carrying shame about spiritual inadequacy. We've become something new together, something that works better than either of us worked alone." Marcus reached up to cover her hand with his own, and Elena felt the warmth of connection that had been building between them for weeks finally crystallize into something undeniable. "I love you," he said, simply the words, carrying none of the dramatic weight of fictional romance, but all the quiet certainty of practical truth. "I love the way you tend to our greenhouse as if it were a sacred space, the way you tell stories that make Kai's eyes light up, the way you've turned this survival shelter into an actual home." "I love you too," Elena replied, the admission feeling both momentous and natural. "I love your steady competence, the way you fix things without making a big production of it, the way you've learned to read Kai's moods as well as I do. I love that you saved us not just from freezing to death, but from the loneliness of trying to rebuild our lives in isolation." What followed was not the dramatic crescendo of passionate romance that characterized so many rescue stories, but something quieter and more sustainable. The gentle acknowledgement of two people who had found in each other not just attraction or compatibility, but genuine partnership in the work of creating a life worth living. They talked through the night, sharing plans and hopes and fears with the kind of openness that Elena had never experienced in her previous relationships. Marcus showed her his detailed sketches for facility improvements that would accommodate long-term family living. Elena described her ideas for establishing a small garden that could provide both practical nutrition and cultural connection to her heritage. As dawn approached, or what passed for dawn on Alpha 16, where the distinction between day and night was marked more by system cycling than by natural light, they made plans that felt both ambitious and achievable. They would expand the greenhouse, improve the living quarters, establish better communication systems that could connect them to the outside world without compromising their security. Most importantly, they would make their commitment to each other and to Kai explicit and formal, creating the kind of chosen family that could weather whatever challenges Alpha 16 might throw at them in the future. "We're going to be okay," Elena said, as they finally prepared to get some rest before Kai woke up and demanded breakfast and stories and attention. "Whatever comes next, we're going to face it together." But even as she spoke the words, Elena felt a small chill that had nothing to do with Alpha 16's eternal winter. Happiness once found always felt fragile, always carried the shadow of potential loss. And in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful interlude was about to be tested in ways they hadn't yet imagined. The storm that struck Alpha 16 3 days after Elena and Marcus had confessed their love was unlike anything in the facility's recorded meteorological data. Marcus stared at the atmospheric readings with growing alarm as wind speeds climbed past the 100-kilometer-per-hour mark and external temperatures plummeted to minus 57 degrees Celsius. This wasn't just another of Alpha 16's brutal winter storms. This was the kind of weather event that could strip the atmosphere from smaller planets and turn even the most advanced survival shelters into frozen tombs. "How long until it passes?" Elena asked, joining him at the control console while Kai continued sleeping in their secured inner compartment. They had moved him there as soon as the first weather warnings appeared, preparing for what they hoped would be just another test of their facility's resilience. "The meteorological models are showing conflicting data," Marcus replied grimly, pointing to the screens that displayed swirling patterns of atmospheric chaos. "The storm system is larger than anything the sensors have tracked before, and it's not following predictable patterns. Best case scenario, we're looking at 36 hours of extreme conditions. Worst case..." He trailed off, but Elena could read the implications in his expression. "Worst case, we're looking at a complete systems failure," she finished for him. "The kind that turns this place from a rescue story into a tragedy." As if summoned by her words, the facility's emergency klaxons began sounding not the familiar alerts they'd grown accustomed to, but the deep, ominous tones that indicated critical system failures. Marcus's fingers flew over the control interface, calling up diagnostic reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of their situation. "Primary heat exchanger is showing stress fractures," he reported, his voice tight with controlled panic. "The external temperature differential is putting strain on every system we depend on for survival. The greenhouse thermal regulators are already operating beyond their design parameters, and the main power grid is showing fluctuations that suggest we're heading for a cascade failure." Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had characterized her first weeks on Alpha 16, when every day had been a struggle against forces beyond her control. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't a helpless refugee waiting for someone else to save her. This time, she was part of a family with the skills and determination to fight for their survival. "What do we need to do?" she asked the question, carrying none of the desperate pleading that had characterized her earlier crises. This was the voice of a partner asking for her assignment in their shared battle against the elements. "We need to manually regulate the core systems," Marcus replied, already moving toward the facility's maintenance access panels. "The automated systems can't adjust quickly enough to compensate for the rapidly changing conditions. Someone needs to monitor the heat exchangers, constantly making manual adjustments to prevent catastrophic failure. And someone needs to maintain the power distribution," Elena added, understanding the implications even without technical training. "If the electrical grid fails, we lose everything. Heat, air recycling, the greenhouse, even the emergency systems." Marcus nodded grimly. "It's going to require both of us working continuously for however long this storm lasts. We'll need to split the responsibilities and take shifts so that at least one of us is always monitoring the critical systems." What followed was the most intense test of their partnership that Elena could have imagined. Not the gentle cooperation of their greenhouse work, or the shared vulnerability of their evening conversations, but the kind of life-or-death collaboration that stripped away everything non-essential and revealed the core of what they had built together. Elena found herself crawling through maintenance conduits that had never been designed for regular human access, manually adjusting coolant flow rates based on Marcus's shouted instructions from the main control station. Her hands grew numb despite her insulated gloves, and her back ached from working in cramped spaces that forced her into uncomfortable positions for hours at a time. But she never hesitated, never complained, never suggested that maybe the task was beyond her capabilities. Marcus, meanwhile, pushed himself beyond every safety protocol he had ever learned, overriding automated systems that were designed to prevent exactly the kind of dangerous manual interventions he was now implementing. His engineering training screamed warnings about the risks he was taking, but his love for Elena and Kai overrode every caution his rational mind could offer. Core temperature rising in Sector 7, Elena called through the facility's communication system, her voice echoing strangely through the metal corridors. The manual override is responding, but I'm reading stress indicators on the primary coupling. Copy that. Marcus replied, his attention split between multiple diagnostic screens that demanded constant monitoring. Adjusting power distribution to compensate. Can you reach the backup regulator from your position? Elena contorted herself through a particularly narrow access tunnel, pushing her body beyond what she had thought physically possible. The backup regulator was located in a section of the facility that had been designed for emergency access, only a space so confined that even the original engineers had probably never expected anyone to work there for extended periods. I can reach it, she confirmed, her voice strained with effort. But Marcus, I'm seeing something that doesn't match the schematics you showed me. There's additional equipment here that's not on any of the diagrams. Marcus's response was delayed by several seconds, an eternity, when every moment mattered for their survival. And when he spoke, his voice carried a strange note that Elena had never heard before. What kind of equipment? He asked carefully. Elena studied the devices she was seeing, trying to match them against her growing knowledge of the facility's systems. It looks like some kind of advanced communication array, more sophisticated than anything else in this place. And it's connected to the main power grid, drawing significant resources. The silence that followed her observation was broken only by the howling of the storm outside and the mechanical sounds of their life support systems straining against impossible conditions. Elena found herself holding her breath, waiting for Marcus's explanation, suddenly aware that she might have discovered something he had never intended for her to see. "Elena," Marcus said. Finally, his voice heavy with a weight that had nothing to do with the technical crisis they were facing. "I need you to come back to the main control room, now." The tone of his request sent a chill through Elena that had nothing to do with Alpha 16's brutal climate. This wasn't the voice of her partner asking for help with a technical problem. This was the voice of someone who had been caught in a deception so fundamental that it threatened to unravel everything they had built together. She made her way back through the maintenance tunnels with growing dread, her mind racing through possible explanations for what she had discovered. By the time she emerged into the main control room, she had constructed and discarded a dozen scenarios, none of which prepared her for what she found waiting for her. Marcus stood beside the main control console, but he wasn't alone. 3 figures in advanced environmental suits occupied the space that had been their private sanctuary, their faces obscured by reflective visors that made them look more like machines than humans. The storm still raged outside, but somehow these strangers had made it through conditions that should have been impossible to survive. "Elena," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was about to destroy everything he valued most. "I need to tell you something about who I really am and why I'm really here." Elena felt the world shift beneath her feet, the same disorienting sensation she had experienced when the Silver Hearth caste elders had declared her spiritually contaminated. The difference was that this time the betrayal was coming from someone she loved, someone she had trusted with her life and her son's life. "You're not just a guilt-ridden engineer hiding from his failures." She said the words coming out flat and emotionless as she tried to process what was happening. "Are you?" "I am a guilt-ridden engineer," Marcus replied, and Elena could hear the pain in his voice even through her shock. That part was true. The failure at Kepler Station, my niece's death, the guilt that drove me to Alpha 16, all of that was real. But I'm also something else. One of the environmental suits stepped forward, and Elena heard a voice that was clearly female, clearly human, but carrying an authority that made the facility's emergency alarm seem quiet by comparison. "Marcus Chen is a deep-cover operative for the Galactic Environmental Protection Agency," the woman said. "He's been monitoring Alpha 16 for illegal resource extraction and documenting evidence of corporate environmental crimes, that contributed to the terraforming project's failure. Elena stared at Marcus, trying to reconcile this revelation with the man who had saved her life, who had helped her build a greenhouse, who had whispered words of love just days ago. "The communication equipment I found," she said slowly. "You've been reporting our presence here. You've been reporting on me and Kai." "No," Marcus said quickly, stepping toward her before one of the suited figures blocked his path. "Elena, you have to understand, yes, I was originally here on an undercover assignment. But everything changed when I found you and Kai. I stopped filing reports weeks ago. I've been protecting you, not exposing you. But they're here now." Elena pointed out, gesturing toward the three strangers who had somehow made it through the storm that was supposed to be unsurvivable. "Which means either you contacted them or your communication equipment was monitored by people who knew how to trace it." The woman in the environmental suit spoke again, her voice carrying the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that Elena remembered from her worst interactions with authorities. "Elena, Aljavier, you and your son are persons of interest in an ongoing investigation. The Silver Hearth Caste has filed formal complaints with the Galactic Council alleging that you stole cultural artifacts and sensitive religious materials when you were exiled." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. "The story chips," she whispered. "They're claiming I stole the story chips." "Among other things," the woman continued, "your exile was not simply a matter of spiritual discipline, as you've been telling people. You were formally accused of corrupting sacred materials and endangering community spiritual welfare through unauthorized cultural transmission." The words hit Elena like physical blows, each one designed to destroy not just her sense of safety, but her understanding of her own identity. She had thought her exile was cruel but comprehensible, the result of a community that couldn't accommodate authentic grief. Now she was being told that her own people had branded her not just spiritually unbalanced, but an actual criminal. "That's not true," she said, but even as she spoke, she could feel doubt creeping into her voice. The story chips she had shared with Marcus and Kai, had she had the right to do that? The cultural knowledge she had been passing on to her son, was that actually a form of theft? "Elena," Marcus said, his voice cutting through her spiral of self-doubt. "None of that matters right now. What matters is that these people came here during a storm that should have killed them, which means they have resources and technology that far exceed what any environmental protection agency should have access to." Elena looked more carefully at the three figures in their environmental suits, and Marcus was right. The equipment they were wearing was more advanced than anything she had seen even in the most sophisticated facilities on Alpha 16. These weren't standard protective suits. They were military-grade environmental armor designed for hostile planet operations. "Who are you really?" she asked the woman who'd been speaking for the group. The woman reached up and removed her helmet, revealing a face that was perfectly human, but somehow wrong, too symmetrical, too composed, too much like a mask designed to inspire trust rather than genuine human features. "We're here to collect you and your son," she said simply. "The charges against you are serious, but there may be opportunities for negotiation if you cooperate fully with our investigation." Elena felt everything she had built with Marcus and Kai crumbling around her, the warmth and safety of their makeshift family, dissolving into the kind of bureaucratic nightmare she had fled when she left the Silver Hearth Caste. But this time she wasn't alone. This time she had people who loved her enough to fight for her. "No," she said, simply the word, carrying all the strength she had gained during her weeks of building a life worth defending. "I'm not going anywhere with you. This is my home now, and these are my people." Outside, the storm raged with unprecedented fury, but Elena discovered that she was no longer afraid of the cold. 6 months after the storm that had brought both revelation and transformation to their lives, Elena stood in the expanded greenhouse watching Kai chase butterflies that had somehow found their way to Alpha 16. The sight should have been impossible, delicate creatures with gossamer wings thriving in an environment that had once been nothing but ice and desolation. Yet here they were dancing among flowering vines that Elena had never expected to see bloom in this lifetime. "Mama, look!" Kai called out, his bioluminescent freckles pulsing with joy as one of the butterflies landed on his outstretched finger. "It chose me." Elena smiled, remembering how that same wonder had transformed everything about their situation. The authorities who had come during the storm, who had threatened to tear apart the family they had built, had found themselves facing something they hadn't expected: a child whose happiness was so genuine, so radiant, that it forced them to question the nature of the charges they were there to investigate. Marcus emerged from the facility's main corridor carrying a data pad that contained the morning's communications from the outside world. Over the past months, their isolated refuge had become something unprecedented. A legitimate research station documenting one of the most remarkable environmental recovery stories in recorded galactic history. Another university wants to send a team to study the ecosystem restoration. Marcus reported, settling beside Elena on the bench they had built from salvaged materials. "That makes 7 institutions requesting access this month." Elena took the data pad and scrolled through messages from xenobiologists, atmospheric engineers, and cultural anthropologists who had heard rumors of what was happening on Alpha 16. The failed terraforming project that corporate interests had abandoned was experiencing a revival that defied every scientific model. More importantly, it was being guided by a family whose combination of technical knowledge, cultural wisdom, and pure determination had created something that university researchers were calling miraculous. "What did you tell them?" Elena asked, though she could guess from the satisfied expression on Marcus's face. "The same thing I tell everyone," Marcus replied. "That this is a working family farm, not a research facility. Visitors are welcome if they come to help with the work, not just to observe and document." It had taken months for Elena to fully understand the shift in power dynamics that had occurred during that confrontational night 6 months ago. The authorities who had come to arrest her had found themselves unable to explain how charges of cultural theft could be sustained against someone who was actively preserving and sharing heritage that would have been lost otherwise. More critically, they had been unable to justify removing a child from an environment where he was clearly thriving. The woman with the too-perfect face, who had turned out to be a mid-level bureaucrat from the Cultural Preservation Authority, rather than the military operative she had pretended to be, had left Alpha 16 with a report that inadvertently became a case study in successful refugee integration and environmental restoration. Elena's unauthorized cultural transmission had become innovative preservation methodology. Marcus's failure to report refugee presence had become facilitating humanitarian rescue and successful integration. "Do you ever miss it?" Marcus asked, nodding toward the datapad full of academic inquiries. "The recognition, the formal acknowledgement of your expertise." Elena considered the question while watching Kai demonstrate to a butterfly how his freckles could pulse in rhythm with its wing beats. "I have recognition," she said finally. "Kai knows the stories of our people because I taught them to him. The plants in this greenhouse grow because I understood their needs. Students from across the galaxy want to learn our techniques because what we've accomplished here matters." She reached over and took Marcus's hand, noting how the calluses from their shared work had created new patterns on both their palms. "The Silver Hearth cast taught me that validation had to come from institutional authority, that my worth was determined by hierarchical approval. But living here has taught me that the most meaningful recognition comes from results, from life flourishing, from stories preserved, from love shared." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "I got a message from my sister yesterday," he said quietly. "She wants to visit, bring her family to see how we've built something here." Elena heard the uncertainty in his voice and understood its source. The guilt that had driven Marcus to Alpha 16 hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had been transformed by their shared work into something more sustainable, not self-punishment, but commitment to doing better. His sister's desire to visit represented a kind of reconciliation with the family he had thought he'd lost through his failures. "What did you tell her?" Elena asked. "That she's welcome," Marcus replied. "That there's room for anyone who wants to help make things grow." A year ago, Elena would have been terrified by the prospect of strangers entering their sanctuary. Now, the idea of sharing their success with people who had loved Marcus before his exile felt like a natural extension of the family they had already created. Their home had grown from a survival shelter into something larger, a demonstration that heartwarming rescue stories could become something more permanent and transformative. "Mama Marcus," Kai called from across the greenhouse. "Come see what I found." They made their way through the thriving plant life vegetables that provided practical nutrition, flowers that offered beauty, and herbs that carried the aromatic memories of Elena's homeworld to where Kai was crouched beside a section of wall that had once been bare metal. "Look," he said, pointing to what appeared to be a small crack in the facility's structure. But as Elena knelt beside him, she saw that the crack had been filled with something organic, a kind of moss or lichen that was growing directly from the building's foundation. "It's the building itself," Kai explained, with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a 5-year-old who had grown up watching impossible things become routine. "It wants to be part of the garden, too." Elena exchanged a glance with Marcus, both of them recognizing the significance of what Kai had discovered. The facility wasn't just containing their artificial ecosystem, it was becoming part of it, integrating with the life they had created until the boundaries between built environment and natural habitat were beginning to blur. "This is what we're really documenting," Marcus said softly. "Not just environmental restoration, but the creation of something entirely new. A fusion of technology and biology, individual survival and community-building exile and belonging." Elena stood and looked around the greenhouse that had become the heart of their world. Through the transparent dome, she could see the endless white of Alpha 16's winter landscape, but it no longer looked hostile. It looked like a canvas waiting for their next project, a challenge that their combined skills and love could transform into something life-sustaining. "The story chips you preserved," Marcus continued, gesturing toward the cultural artifacts that had become the foundation of Kai's education. "They're not museum pieces anymore. They're living documents passed from mother to son to whoever else wants to learn. The engineering techniques that keep this place running aren't corporate secrets, they're innovations we share with anyone who needs them." Elena nodded, understanding what he was describing. "We've become something new," she said. "Not silver hearth cast midwife or guilt-ridden engineer or refugee mother. Something that incorporates all of those things but isn't limited by any of them." As evening approached, the subtle shift in Alpha 16's eternal twilight that had taught them to measure time by internal rhythms, rather than solar cycles, they prepared for their daily ritual of reviewing the day's accomplishments and planning tomorrow's work. It was a practice that had evolved naturally from their early survival planning into something more contemplative and forward-looking. "What's the most important thing that happened today?" Elena asked Kai as they settled into their comfortable evening routine. "The butterfly chose me," Kai replied without hesitation. "And the building wants to grow. And tomorrow Uncle Chen is sending a message about visiting." Elena smiled at his easy inclusion of Marcus's family members he had never met into his expanding definition of their household. This was the real miracle of their survival story, not just that they had lived through the immediate crisis, but that they had created space for their family to continue growing. "What about you, Marcus?" Elena asked. "I realized that the investigation report from 6 months ago has been forwarded to the Galactic Environmental Council," Marcus said. "They're considering Alpha 16 as a model for sustainable refugee integration and ecological restoration. We might get formal recognition as a demonstration site." Elena felt a warm glow of satisfaction that had nothing to do with external validation and everything to do with the knowledge that their personal healing had created something valuable for others facing similar challenges. "And you, Elena?" Marcus asked. "I realized that we've proven something important," Elena said, looking around at their warm, thriving sanctuary. "Exile doesn't have to mean permanent displacement. Sometimes it means finding your way to where you were always supposed to be. Outside, Alpha 16's wind whispered through the facility's improved infrastructure, carrying the promise of tomorrow's possibilities. Inside, 3 people who had found each other in desperation had built something that would endure, not just a survival story, but a love story. Not just a rescue, but a transformation that would inspire true stories of hope for generations to come. Outro. 90 seconds. Elena's story reminds us that sometimes our greatest rescues aren't dramatic gestures, but the quiet choice to build something meaningful from broken pieces. In our own lives, we all face those moments when everything seems lost, when we're tempted to surrender to the cold. But like Elena, Marcus, and Kai, we have the power to transform exile into belonging, survival into thriving, and strangers into family. Welcome to Galactic Sci-Fi Saga, where humanity doesn't just survive the cosmos, we reshape it with courage, compassion, and unbreakable determination. This channel is your gateway to immersive science fiction storytelling that celebrates the incredible resilience of the human spirit. From desperate last stands among the stars to unexpected first contacts that change everything. Every saga here proves that when humanity faces the impossible, we don't just endure, we transcend. If Elena's journey from frozen despair to flourishing hope moved, you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because there are countless more stories of humans rising, resisting, and rebuilding waiting for you. Support this channel by watching our ads all the way through, and let me know in the comments which moment from Elena's story resonated most with your own experiences of finding home in unexpected places. You're now part of a community that believes in the transformative power of storytelling, where every exile can become an explorer, every refugee can become a pioneer, and every ending can become a new beginning. Until our next galactic adventure, remember, the greatest rescue stories aren't about being saved. They're about learning to save each other. Keep building your warmth in the cold, and I'll see you among the stars.